Welcome, and thank you for joining me tonight for another restful story from long ago. As the world outside grows still, I invite you to slow down and settle in for a soft journey through history's quieter corners. Tell me, if you'd like, where are you listening from, and what time is it right now? It's a lovely thought. All of us scattered across time zones, sharing this moment. This is the story of what it was truly like to be a soldier in World War II. Not the sanitized version you see in movies, but the raw, unfiltered reality of men who lived through hell and somehow found the strength to keep going. Over the next hour, we'll walk in their boots through the mud of Normandy, the frozen foxholes of the Ardennes, and the sweltering jungles of the Pacific. We'll discover how ordinary young men from farms and factories were transformed into warriors, and how they coped with horrors that would break most people today. Before we begin this journey, I want you to understand something crucial. The soldiers of World War II didn't fight for abstract concepts like democracy or freedom, though those mattered. They fought for the man next to them. They fought because going home meant surviving another day, and surviving meant doing whatever it took to keep their brothers alive. This is their story, told through the eyes of those who were there, who felt the fear, who pulled the trigger, who watched friends die, and who somehow found the courage to continue when everything inside them screamed to run. Picture yourself as Private Johnson, 19 years old, from a small town in Iowa where the biggest excitement was the county fair. 6 months ago, you were worried about asking Sarah Mitchell to the school dance. Now, you're crouched in a foxhole outside St. Vith, Belgium, listening to the whistle of incoming artillery shells and wondering if you'll live to see 20. The transformation from civilian to soldier was supposed to take months of training, but war has a way of accelerating everything, including how quickly you learn that the difference between life and death often comes down to pure luck. Your journey to this moment began on a Tuesday morning in December 1941, when you and your buddies were listening to the radio in Peterson's drugstore. The music stopped, and suddenly a voice was telling you that Pearl Harbor had been attacked. Within 6 months, you'd gone from milking cows and worrying about crop prices to learning how to field strip an M1 Garand in the dark and how to recognize the sound of different types of incoming fire. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared you for what combat actually feels like. The first thing that hits you about war is the noise. Not just the obvious sounds like gunfire and explosions, but the constant, overwhelming cacophony that never stops. There's the metallic clink of equipment as men move, the squelch of boots in mud, the hiss of radio static, the drone of aircraft overhead that could be friend or foe, and underneath it all, the sound of your own breathing, amplified inside your helmet until it sounds like a steam engine. Sleep, when it comes at all, is fitful and light because your subconscious never stops cataloguing sounds, trying to separate the dangerous from the merely annoying. But it's the smell that really gets to you. Books and movies never mention the smell of war. There's the acrid bite of cordite from explosives, the sweet sick stench of gangrene, the cloying smell of unwashed bodies that have been living in the same clothes for weeks, and underneath everything else, the unmistakable odor of death that clings to everything and everyone. You try breathing through your mouth, but then you can taste it, and somehow that's worse. After a while, you stop noticing it consciously, but it never really goes away. Years later, certain smells will take you right back to those moments, whether you want to go or not. The cold is something else entirely. Not the kind of cold you knew back home, where you could always go inside and warm up by the fire. This is cold that gets into your bones and stays there. Cold that makes your rifle freeze up and your fingers too numb to work the bolt properly. In the Ardennes forest, during the Battle of the Bulge, temperatures dropped to -20 degrees Fahrenheit. and men were dying from frostbite faster than they were dying from German bullets. You learn to sleep with your rifle inside your sleeping bag to keep the firing mechanism from freezing solid. You learn to rotate socks and boots with your foxhole partner to prevent trench foot, a condition where your feet literally begin to rot inside your boots. Private Martinez from Texas, who'd never seen snow before shipping out to Europe, lost 3 toes to frostbite during the siege of Bastogne. He kept fighting for another 2 weeks before anyone realized how bad it was, because complaining about the cold seemed pointless when everyone was suffering equally. The medics said he was lucky to keep his feet at all. Martinez just nodded and asked when he could get back to his unit. That's the thing about war that's hard to explain to people who weren't there. The normal rules of what constitutes acceptable suffering get completely rewritten. Food becomes an obsession, not because you're starving exactly, though sometimes you are, but because a hot meal represents something approaching normalcy in a world that has gone completely insane. K rations were supposed to provide adequate nutrition for fighting men, but after weeks of eating the same combinations of canned meat, crackers, and processed cheese, the taste becomes a kind of torture. You fantasize about your mother's cooking with the same intensity that you used to reserve for thinking about girls. A letter from home describing a Sunday dinner can reduce a hardened combat veteran to tears, not from sadness, but from the sheer longing for something that represents life instead of mere survival. Sergeant Williams from Alabama once told his squad that he'd give a month's pay for a plate of his grandmother's cornbread and ham. 2 days later, he stepped on a mine while leading a patrol through a minefield outside Aachen. His last words were asking if anyone had saved him some cornbread from breakfast. The men in his unit pooled their rations that night and tried to make something that resembled what he'd described, using crumbled crackers and bits of canned ham. It was terrible, but they ate every bite and told stories about Sergeant Williams and his grandmother's cooking until dawn. The enemy, when you actually see them, are just as scared and cold and homesick as you are. This realization hits you like a physical blow the first time you look into the eyes of a German soldier you've just shot. He's maybe 17 years old, with a photograph of a girl tucked into his helmet band, and he's calling for his mother in a language you don't understand but somehow comprehend perfectly. You expected to feel triumph or relief or satisfaction, but instead you feel sick and hollow and guilty in a way that will never completely go away. Corporal Anderson from Minnesota described it this way in a letter home that he never sent. They told us the Krauts were monsters, and maybe some of them are, but most of them are just kids like us who want to go home to their families. The hard part isn't killing them when you have to. Anderson survived the war, but never talked about his combat experiences, even to his wife and children. Like so many veterans, he carried those memories alone until the day he died. Sleep, when it comes, brings no relief, because that's when the nightmares start. You dream about the faces of men you've killed, about friends who died in your arms, about explosions and fire and screaming that goes on forever. You wake up in a cold sweat, reaching for your rifle that isn't there. Your heart hammering so hard, you're sure everyone in the foxhole can hear it. Sometimes you're not sure if you're awake or still dreaming, because the line between nightmare and reality has blurred beyond recognition. Lieutenant Thompson from Oregon kept a diary throughout his time in Europe, though regulations technically forbade it. One entry, dated January 15, 1945, reads, "Didn't sleep again last night. Every time I close my eyes, I see Henderson getting hit by that sniper. The bullet took half his head off, but he lived for almost 10 minutes, making these awful sounds. I keep thinking I should have done something. But what? What could I have done?" The medic said he was probably already gone, that it was just his body not knowing it yet. But those sounds... The bonds you form with your fellow soldiers are unlike anything you've ever experienced or ever will again. These men become closer to you than your own brothers, because they're the only ones who truly understand what you're going through. You share everything with them. Your food, your warmth, your fears, your hopes, and sometimes your life. When one of them dies, a part of you dies too, but you can't stop to grieve because stopping means dying, and dying means letting down the men who are still alive and counting on you. Private Rodriguez from New Mexico and Private O'Brien from Boston couldn't have been more different in background and temperament, but after fighting together for 8 months, they could communicate with just a look. During the crossing of the Rhine River, Rodriguez was wounded by shrapnel and couldn't swim with his gear on. O'Brien, who was terrified of water and had never learned to swim properly himself, jumped back into the freezing river without hesitation and dragged Rodriguez to safety. Neither man ever talked about it afterward, because what was there to say? You do what you have to do for your brothers, and then you move on to the next crisis. Leadership in combat bears no resemblance to leadership in civilian life. Officers who looked good on parade grounds and spoke well in briefings sometimes crumbled under the pressure of making life and death decisions with incomplete information and no time to think. Meanwhile, quiet men who'd never held authority over anyone suddenly found themselves taking charge because someone had to. And they were the ones willing to make the hard choices that kept their units alive. Captain Davis from Georgia was a bank manager before the war, used to dealing with paperwork and customer complaints. In combat, he had to decide whether to send his men across an open field under machine gun fire to take an objective that might not even matter in the larger scheme of things. He had to write letters to the families of men who died following his orders. He had to look 19-year-old soldiers in the eye and tell them to do things that might get them killed, knowing that some of them wouldn't come back, and that their deaths would be on his conscience forever. The randomness of death in war is perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of combat. You can do everything right, follow every procedure, take every precaution, and still die because a shell lands 3 feet to the left instead of 3 feet to the right. Meanwhile, the guy who constantly breaks rules and takes unnecessary risks somehow makes it through battle after battle without a scratch. There's no logic to it, no justice, no grand design. It's just chance, pure and simple, and that knowledge eats away at your sanity like acid. Sergeant Murphy from Texas survived D-Day, the Battle of St. Vith, the crossing of the Rhine, and dozens of smaller engagements. He was killed by a sniper on May 7th, 1945, one day before Germany surrendered. The bullet hit him while he was sharing chocolate with some German children whose village had just been liberated. His squad leader wrote to Murphy's mother that he died doing what he'd always done, trying to make life a little better for someone else. But the cruel irony that he'd survived years of combat only to die hours before the war ended was not lost on anyone who knew him. Equipment failure wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a death sentence. Your rifle jamming at the wrong moment, your radio going dead when you needed to call for artillery support, your parachute not opening properly, your tank breaking down in the middle of a firefight. You learned to maintain your gear obsessively, checking and rechecking everything multiple times a day, because your life and the lives of your squad mates depended on things working when they were supposed to work. Private Jackson from Detroit was a mechanic before the war, and his knowledge of engines and mechanical systems made him invaluable to his unit. He could fix almost anything with whatever materials were available, often improvising solutions that saved lives. During the Battle of the Bulge, he kept their Sherman tank running for 3 days after taking a hit that should have disabled it, using parts cannibalized from destroyed vehicles and wire from telephone poles. When they finally reached friendly lines, the tank died permanently just as they crossed into the safe zone, as if it had been holding on through sheer willpower. The mail from home was both a blessing and a curse. Letters brought news of family and friends, reminders of what you were fighting for, and proof that a world still existed beyond the immediate horror of combat. But they also highlighted how far removed you'd become from normal life. how impossible it was to explain your experiences to people who hadn't been there, and how much you'd changed from the person who'd left home all those months ago. Corporal Wilson from Ohio received a letter from his girlfriend complaining that he hadn't written enough romantic letters lately, that his correspondence had become too brief and factual. How could he explain that he'd seen his best friend die screaming the day before he wrote that letter? How could he tell her about the German teenager he'd killed in hand-to-hand combat, or the way the smell of death clung to everything? How could he write about love and future plans when he wasn't sure he'd live to see next week, or even if the person he was becoming was someone she could still love? Medical care in the field was a constant struggle between what was ideal and what was possible. Medics performed miracles with limited supplies and training, often under enemy fire, but they couldn't save everyone. Triage decisions meant choosing who lived and who died based on who had the best chance of survival, not who deserved to live more. These choices haunted the medical personnel for the rest of their lives, but they had to be made because saving some was better than saving none. Doc Patterson from Kansas was barely 21 years old, with 6 months of medical training, when he found himself performing emergency surgery in a bombed-out church during the Battle of Normandy. He saved the lives of 16 men that day, working by candlelight with artillery shells exploding outside. He lost 4 others, including his closest friend, because he didn't have enough blood plasma and had to choose who got it. 50 years later, he could still remember the names of all 4 men he couldn't save, and he visited their graves every year until he died. Weather wasn't just uncomfortable, it was another enemy to fight. Rain turned roads into impassable mud, grounded aircraft that could provide support, and made everything from eating to sleeping to fighting infinitely more difficult. Snow provided camouflage, but also made movement slow and noisy. Heat in the Pacific Theater brought dehydration, heat stroke, and tropical diseases that could disable entire units. During the Italian campaign, Corporal Hayes from Montana and his squad spent 6 days pinned down by German artillery in a position that offered no shelter from the rain. They couldn't move without being spotted and killed, but staying meant slowly succumbing to exposure and trench foot. Hayes later wrote that the rain was worse than the shells because at least the shells were quick. The rain was a constant torture that never stopped, turning their foxholes into pools of freezing water and making every piece of equipment heavier and harder to use. The noise of modern warfare was beyond anything in previous human experience. Artillery barrages could be heard from 20 miles away and felt in your bones from 5 miles. The sound of incoming shells developed a distinctive whistle that could make you dive for cover even decades after the war ended. Machine gun fire, rifle shots, aircraft engines, tank treads, and human screaming all blended together into a hellish symphony that never completely left your ears. Private Foster from Vermont developed what would later be recognized as severe hearing damage from repeated exposure to artillery fire, but at the time, it was just another fact of life. He learned to read lips because verbal communication was often impossible over the noise of battle. Years after the war, he couldn't stand fireworks or loud noises of any kind because they brought back memories of moments when sound meant death was coming. Combat fatigue, what we now call PTSD, was poorly understood and often stigmatized as cowardice or weakness. Men who had fought bravely for months suddenly found themselves unable to function, shaking uncontrollably, or catatonic with fear. Some were treated with sympathy and given rest. Others were court-martialed for desertion or failure to follow orders. The lucky ones were rotated back to rear areas where they could recover somewhat before being returned to the front lines. He'd seen his unit reduced from 180 men to 34 effectives through casualties, and had personally killed at least a dozen enemy soldiers in close combat. He started having panic attacks during artillery barrages and became unable to make decisions under pressure. He spent the rest of the war feeling like a failure, convinced that he'd let his men down, not understanding that his mind and body had simply reached their breaking point. The transition from civilian morality to the necessities of combat was jarring and permanent. You were raised to believe that killing was wrong, that human life was sacred, that violence should be avoided whenever possible. Then you were handed a rifle and told that your job was to kill other human beings as efficiently as possible. Some men never fully made that transition and paid for it with their lives. Others made it too well and worried about what they'd become. Sergeant Brooks from Michigan was a Sunday school teacher before the war, a gentleman who'd never been in a fight in his life. He never lost his faith, but he struggled for the rest of his life with the contradiction between his Christian beliefs and the things he'd done in combat. He eventually became a minister, but he never felt worthy of the calling, always believing that God couldn't truly forgive what he'd done, even in service of his country. Food obsessions became almost universal among combat troops. Men who'd never cared much about cooking or eating became connoisseurs of military rations, able to identify different manufacturers of K-rations by taste and capable of elaborate trades to get preferred items. A chocolate bar could be worth more than money, and a hot meal was a luxury beyond price. Private Romano from New York carried a photograph of his mother's lasagna in his wallet, next to the pictures of his girlfriend and family. He'd show it to anyone who would look and describe every ingredient in detail: how his mother made the sauce, how long she cooked it, what kind of cheese she used. His squad mates thought he was crazy until they realized that talking about food was one of the few things that made them feel human again. They started sharing their own food memories, creating elaborate fantasy meals from their combined recollections. The weight of equipment was a constant burden that civilians couldn't truly understand. Your basic load included rifle, ammunition, helmet, first aid kit, entrenching tool, canteen, mess kit, extra clothing, and personal items. In winter, add heavy coats and boots. In the Pacific, add mosquito netting and tropical gear. In total, you carried between 60 and 80 pounds of equipment everywhere you went, and you had to be ready to fight, run, or take cover at any moment while wearing all of it. Corporal Martinez from California was 5 feet 6 inches tall and weighed 140 pounds, but he carried the same load as men who were 6 inches taller and 50 pounds heavier. He developed a technique for distributing the weight that he taught to other smaller soldiers, showing them how to adjust straps and pack items to minimize fatigue. He joked that the army had turned him into a pack mule, but everyone knew that his ability to keep up with larger men while carrying a full load had saved lives during long marches and quick movements. Sleep deprivation was chronic and severe. Combat operations often continued around the clock, and even during quiet periods, someone had to stand watch. Soldiers learned to sleep anywhere, anytime, for any length of time. A 5-minute nap could be the difference between alertness and dangerous fatigue. You slept standing up, sitting down, lying in mud during artillery barrages, and with one eye open for enemy movement. Lieutenant Morrison from Washington State once calculated that during a particularly intense 2-week period, he'd gotten a total of 18 hours of sleep. He started hallucinating during the day, seeing enemy soldiers who weren't there and hearing voices calling his name. His sergeant had to physically restrain him from responding to orders that existed only in his exhausted mind. After finally getting 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep, Morrison realized how close he'd come to getting himself and his men killed through fatigue-induced mistakes. Personal hygiene became impossible to maintain, according to civilian standards, but soldiers developed their own standards based on what was practical and necessary. A weekly shave was a luxury, a monthly shower was a miracle, and clean clothes were so rare that men would fight over them. Dental care consisted of whatever you could manage with a toothbrush and whatever passed for toothpaste when those items were available. Private Anderson from South Dakota went 4 months without a proper bath during the Italian campaign. He and his squad mates developed a rotation system for using a single bar of soap and a helmet full of cold water to wash the most essential body parts. They joked about being able to smell enemy positions because nothing could smell worse than they did. But the reality was that poor hygiene led to infections, skin diseases, and general misery that sapped strength and morale. The casualty rates in frontline infantry units were staggering and often suppressed to maintain morale. Some companies lost over 200% of their authorized strength during extended campaigns, meaning they were completely replaced twice over with fresh replacements. The psychological impact of watching new faces constantly appear and disappear was devastating for the survivors, who began to feel like they were cursed or that forming friendships was pointless. Captain Henderson from Iowa took command of a rifle company in September 1944 with 186 men. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, only 12 of the original men were still with the unit, and Henderson himself had been wounded 3 times. He stopped learning the names of replacement soldiers after a while, referring to them by their job descriptions instead, because it hurt too much to watch them die before he'd had time to know them as individuals. Mail call was the highlight of every soldier's day, but it was also a source of tremendous anxiety. Getting mail meant that people back home still cared and remembered you existed. Not getting mail could mean that your letters weren't reaching home, that people had forgotten you, or worst of all, that something had happened to your family. Letters that brought bad news from home could be more devastating than enemy action. Sergeant Williams from Alabama received a letter informing him that his father had died and his mother was seriously ill, but it took 2 months to reach him due to postal delays and his unit's constant movement. By the time he got permission for emergency leave and travelled home, his mother had recovered and his father had been buried for 6 weeks. The feeling of disconnection from his family and his inability to be there when he was needed ate at him for the rest of his life. Rotation policies varied by theatre and time period, but in general, frontline soldiers could expect to serve until they were killed, wounded seriously enough to be evacuated, or suffered complete mental breakdown. There was no set tour of duty, no guaranteed date when you could go home. This uncertainty was perhaps worse than knowing you had a specific amount of time to survive, because it meant that the war might go on forever as far as you were concerned. Private Johnson from Michigan enlisted in 1942, expecting to serve for the duration of the war, which everyone assumed would be over quickly. By 1945, he'd been in combat for over 2 years, with no end in sight. He'd stopped making plans for after the war because it seemed like tempting fate. When Germany finally surrendered, his first reaction wasn't relief, but disbelief. He'd been a soldier for so long that he couldn't imagine being anything else. The weapons you carried became extensions of your body, maintained with religious devotion because your life depended on them functioning perfectly when needed. You knew every part of your rifle by touch, could field strip and reassemble it in complete darkness, and could tell by the sound whether it was functioning properly. You named your weapons, talked to them, and trusted them more than you trusted most people. Corporal Davis from Texas named his M1 Garand Betsy and treated it better than he treated himself. He cleaned it obsessively, even when he was too tired to eat or too cold to feel his fingers. Betsy never jammed, never misfired, and never failed to function when Davis needed it most. He credited the rifle with saving his life at least a dozen times and was devastated when he had to turn it in at the end of the war. Years later, he said giving up Betsy was harder than leaving his squad mates because the rifle had been with him through every moment of terror and triumph. Winter warfare presented challenges that went beyond simple cold. Equipment froze and became useless. Vehicles wouldn't start. Weapons jammed. And men died from exposure as easily as from enemy fire. The Battle of the Bulge was fought in some of the worst winter weather in decades, with temperatures dropping below zero and snow so deep that movement was nearly impossible. Private Thompson from Minnesota thought he understood cold weather, having grown up on a farm where winter chores had to be done regardless of temperature. But the cold in the Ardennes forest was different. A penetrating, life-threatening cold that made every action difficult and dangerous. His rifle froze solid during one firefight, leaving him defenseless until he could thaw it against his body heat. He learned to keep critical equipment inside his clothes, against his skin, trading comfort for functionality. Leadership under fire revealed character in ways that peacetime never could. Some officers, who seemed weak or indecisive in training, became towers of strength in combat, while others who appeared confident and capable crumbled under the pressure of making life and death decisions. The men quickly learned to distinguish between leaders they would follow anywhere and those they wouldn't trust with their lives. Lieutenant Parker from Oregon was fresh out of officer training school and looked about 16 years old when he joined his unit. The enlisted men initially had no confidence in him and made jokes about the kid behind his back. But during his first firefight, Parker exposed himself to enemy fire 3 times to rescue wounded soldiers and personally led an assault that knocked out a machine gun nest. After that day, his men would have followed him into hell itself. Age and appearance meant nothing. What mattered was whether you would risk your own life for the lives of your soldiers. The sound of incoming artillery was something that got into your soul and never left. Veterans could distinguish between different types of shells by their whistle, the high-pitched scream of an 88mm, the deeper whoosh of heavy mortars, the freight train rumble of rocket artillery. Each sound triggered an immediate physical response, even decades after the war ended. Men would dive for cover at construction sites when they heard similar sounds, their bodies reacting faster than their minds could process that they were safe. Sergeant Rodriguez from New Mexico developed an almost supernatural ability to predict where shells would land based on their sound. He saved countless lives by shouting warnings that gave men those crucial extra seconds to find cover. His squad called him the Prophet and credited him with keeping them alive through some of the heaviest bombardments of the war. Rodriguez never understood how he did it. He said the shells just sounded wrong when they were coming close. The replacement system meant that veteran units were constantly receiving new soldiers who had to learn combat skills while under fire. These replacements, often called cherries by the veterans, had a disturbingly high casualty rate because they lacked the instincts and knowledge that kept experienced soldiers alive. Veterans tried to teach them quickly, but there was only so much you could convey in words about things that had to be learned through experience. Private Walsh from Boston was 18 years old when he joined his unit as a replacement during the push into Germany. Within his first week, he'd made every mistake that inexperienced soldiers make, silhouetting himself against the skyline, bunching up with other soldiers, failing to dig his foxhole deep enough. His squad leader, Corporal Jenkins, probably saved Walsh's life a dozen times in those first few days by physically pulling him into cover or correcting dangerous mistakes. Walsh survived the war and credited Jenkins with teaching him how to be a soldier. But Jenkins was killed by a sniper 2 weeks before Germany surrendered. Combat medics faced unique challenges that went beyond their medical training. They had to provide care under fire, often in impossible conditions, with limited supplies and equipment. They saw the worst wounds, held dying men in their arms, and had to make split-second decisions about who could be saved and who was beyond help. Despite being non-combatants protected by the Geneva Convention, medics were often targeted by enemy forces who recognized their importance to unit morale and effectiveness. Doc Martinez from Arizona carried no weapons, as required by the Geneva Convention, but he ran toward gunfire instead of away from it. During a particularly brutal firefight near Aachen, he treated 14 wounded soldiers while under constant sniper fire, using his own body to shield patients while he worked. He was shot twice but continued treating wounded, until he collapsed from blood loss. His patients later said that Martinez never showed fear or panic, even when bullets were hitting the ground around him. His calm presence under fire was as important as his medical skills in keeping men alive. The Pacific Theater presented different but equally brutal challenges. Instead of cold and mud, soldiers faced crushing heat, tropical diseases, and an enemy that followed different rules of warfare. Japanese soldiers rarely surrendered and often fought to the death, making every position a potential death trap. The jungle environment limited visibility to a few yards and turned every advance into a potential ambush. Corporal Johnson from Florida thought he was prepared for tropical warfare, having grown up in the swamps and heat of the Everglades. But the jungles of the Pacific were different. A green hell where visibility was measured in feet, where disease could kill you as quickly as bullets, and where the enemy seemed to appear from nowhere. Johnson learned to fight in 3 dimensions, watching for snipers in trees above, as well as enemies in front and to the sides. He survived Guadalcanal, Bougainville, and Luzon, but said the jungle never stopped trying to kill him, even when the Japanese weren't shooting. Night operations were particularly terrifying because they stripped away most of your senses and forced you to rely on hearing and intuition. Patrols moved in complete darkness, communicating by touch and whispered signals, never knowing if the next step would trigger an ambush or lead into a minefield. The psychological strain of operating blind in hostile territory pushed many soldiers to their breaking point. Lieutenant Brown from Michigan led dozens of night patrols during the Italian campaign, slipping through German lines to gather intelligence and capture prisoners. He developed an almost supernatural ability to the musty smell of unwashed bodies and rotting straw would hit you first. Then the bone-deep exhaustion that came from 16-hour days of back-breaking labor. This was the reality for millions of soldiers who found themselves thrust into the meat grinder of World War II, where survival wasn't guaranteed and comfort was a luxury few could afford. But surviving the brutal conditions was just the beginning, because once you made it through the initial shock of military life, you'd quickly discover that the real enemy wasn't always the one shooting at you from across no man's land. Sometimes it was the lice crawling through your hair, the dysentery that left you doubled over in agony, or the frostbite that claimed your toes one by one during those endless winter nights in foxholes that offered no protection from the elements. The transformation from civilian to soldier happened faster than most expected. One day you're working in a factory or tending a farm, worried about paying rent or asking a girl to dance. The next, you're learning to strip a rifle blindfolded, while drill sergeants scream in your face about the 100 different ways you're going to die if you don't follow orders exactly. The military had perfected the art of breaking down everything you thought you knew about yourself and rebuilding you into something that could function in the chaos of modern warfare. Sleep became a precious commodity that you learned to grab whenever and wherever possible. Soldiers would curl up in muddy trenches, lean against supply crates, or even doze while marching if they were desperate enough. The lucky ones might get 4 hours of uninterrupted rest, but most learned to function on far less. Cat naps between artillery bombardments, quick dozes during lulls in fighting, and the occasional luxury of a full night's sleep in a bombed-out building that still had most of its roof intact. The noise never stopped. Artillery shells whistling overhead, machine gun fire chattering in the distance, aircraft engines droning as bombers passed by on their way to level another city. Even during quiet moments, there was always something. The clanking of equipment, boots squelching through mud, hushed conversations about home or fears about tomorrow's mission. Your ears would ring constantly, and many soldiers would lose significant hearing by the time they made it back home, if they made it back at all. Food was another constant struggle. Military rations were designed for nutrition and shelf life, not taste or satisfaction. Canned meat that looked and tasted like dog food. Hardtack biscuits that could crack teeth. And coffee that was more mud than beverage. Fresh food was a rare treat that soldiers would trade precious cigarettes or personal items to obtain. A single apple or a piece of chocolate could lift spirits in ways that civilians could never understand. The weight of equipment was crushing, literally and figuratively. A fully loaded soldier might carry 60 to 80 pounds of gear: rifle, ammunition, medical supplies, food, water, tools, and personal items. Every ounce mattered when you were marching 20 miles through rough terrain or crawling through barbed wire under enemy fire. Blisters would form and pop and form again. Feet would swell until boots became torture devices, and backs would ache constantly from the strain. Weather was an enemy that never took prisoners and never showed mercy. Scorching desert heat that could kill through dehydration in hours. Monsoon rains that turned everything into a muddy swamp where vehicles got stuck and diseases flourished. Arctic cold that froze weapons, made metal stick to bare skin, and could claim lives just as effectively as any bullet. Soldiers learned to fear the elements almost as much as they feared enemy fire. Personal hygiene became nearly impossible to maintain. Weeks without a proper bath, clothes that rotted off your body, and parasites that made life miserable. Lice would infest hair and clothing, spreading rapidly through close quarters. Fungal infections would develop in warm, moist environments where soldiers couldn't keep clean or dry. The smell of unwashed men, rotting food, and human waste created an atmosphere that would make civilians vomit instantly. The cold was particularly brutal for those fighting in European or Pacific winters. Frostbite would claim fingers and toes with ruthless efficiency. Soldiers would wake up unable to feel their extremities, only to discover blackened flesh that would need to be amputated if infection was to be prevented. Some learned to keep small stones in their boots to maintain circulation, while others would huddle together for warmth in foxholes barely large enough for one person. Disease spread through military units like wildfire. Dysentery would leave soldiers weak and dehydrated, unable to keep food down when they needed calories most. Malaria would strike troops in tropical climates, causing fevers and chills that could incapacitate entire units. Respiratory infections would spread rapidly through crowded barracks and transport ships. The mortality rate from disease often exceeded casualties from enemy action in many theatres of war. Equipment failure was a constant threat that could mean the difference between life and death. Rifles that jammed at crucial moments, radios that failed when calling for support, vehicles that broke down in hostile territory. Soldiers became masters of improvisation, learning to fix complex machinery with whatever materials they could scavenge. A piece of wire might save a life, a spare part could determine the outcome of a mission. The psychological toll was perhaps the most devastating aspect of military service. Watching friends die, killing enemy soldiers who looked barely old enough to shave, seeing civilians caught in the crossfire of military operations. Shell shock, as it was then called, would leave men trembling and unable to function. Some would break down completely, unable to continue fighting. Others would develop a 1,000-yard stare that spoke of horrors no human should witness. Camaraderie became a lifeline that kept many soldiers sane. The bonds formed between men who shared foxholes, rations, and the constant threat of death were unlike anything experienced in civilian life. These relationships transcended normal social barriers. Rich and poor, educated and illiterate, city dwellers and farmers all became brothers in arms. They would share their last cigarette, give up their blanket to a sick comrade, or risk their lives to save a wounded friend. Death was random and arbitrary, striking down the brave and cowardly with equal indifference. A sniper's bullet might find the soldier who had survived a dozen battles, while a green recruit might walk through a minefield unscathed. Soldiers developed a fatalistic attitude toward mortality, knowing that survival often depended more on luck than skill or preparation. Letters from home became precious, beyond measure. News from family, updates about the neighborhood, even mundane details about daily life took on enormous significance. Soldiers would read and reread letters until the paper wore thin, carrying them into battle as talismans against the chaos surrounding them. Writing letters home became a way to maintain connection with the world they were fighting to preserve. The brutality of weather conditions varied dramatically, depending on the theatre of operations. In the Pacific, soldiers faced tropical diseases, poisonous insects, and humidity that made simple tasks exhausting. In North Africa, sandstorms would blind troops and clog weapons with grit that could cause malfunctions at critical moments. In Europe, mud would suck boots right off feet and create conditions where movement became nearly impossible. Medical care was primitive by today's standards, but revolutionary for its time. Field medics would risk their lives to reach wounded soldiers, often crawling through enemy fire to provide aid. Battlefield surgery was performed under horrific conditions, with limited supplies and constant danger. Morphine was precious and rationed carefully, meaning many soldiers endured excruciating pain with minimal relief. The transformation of young men into hardened soldiers was both remarkable and tragic to witness. Boys who had never been away from home learned to kill with efficiency and sleep soundly despite the carnage around them. The innocence that characterized civilian life was stripped away layer by layer until what remained was focused entirely on survival and completing the mission. Supply lines became lifelines that determined whether units lived or died. When supplies failed to arrive, soldiers would go without food, ammunition, or medical supplies. Creative scavenging became an art form as troops learned to find useful materials in the most unlikely places. Enemy equipment would be captured and repurposed. Civilian items would be requisitioned when available. The leadership challenges faced by officers were immense, making decisions that would send men to their deaths, maintaining morale when conditions seemed hopeless, balancing mission objectives with the welfare of troops under their command. Many officers were young and inexperienced, learning leadership skills through trial and error when mistakes could cost lives. Discipline was maintained through a combination of military law and peer pressure. Soldiers who failed to perform their duties endangered their comrades, creating a social dynamic where cowardice was not tolerated. Courts-martial were swift, and punishment severe for those who abandoned their posts or failed to follow orders under fire. The difference between European and Pacific theatres was stark. In Europe, soldiers might find occasional shelter in buildings or towns, while Pacific Island fighting often took place in dense jungle, where visibility was limited to a few yards. European winters brought different challenges than tropical diseases, but both environments tested human endurance to its limits. Medics occupied a unique position in military hierarchy. Officially non-combatants, they would venture into the most dangerous situations to provide aid to wounded soldiers. Their Red Cross markings were supposed to provide protection under international law, but enemy forces didn't always respect these conventions. Many medics died while attempting to save others, earning them special respect from combat troops. The weight of personal equipment was distributed across multiple carrying systems, but soldiers still felt every ounce during long marches or when moving through difficult terrain. Ammunition was heavy but essential. Food was necessary but bulky. Medical supplies could save lives but took up precious space. Every item carried represented a trade-off between utility and burden. Training could only prepare soldiers for so much. The reality of combat was far more chaotic and terrifying than any exercise could simulate. Veterans would often comment that nothing had prepared them for the smell of battle, the confusion of enemy contact, or the emotional impact of losing friends. Experience became the best teacher for those who survived long enough to learn its lessons. Communication systems were primitive and unreliable. Radio equipment was heavy and vulnerable to damage, while telephone lines could be cut by enemy action. Visual signals like flares or flags were often the only way to coordinate movement or call for support. Miscommunication could result in friendly fire incidents or failed missions that cost lives unnecessarily. Transportation was another constant challenge. Vehicles would break down in harsh conditions. Ships would sink from enemy action or storms. Aircraft would crash from mechanical failure or combat damage. Soldiers often had to continue missions on foot when motorized transport failed, carrying additional equipment to compensate for lost mobility. The psychological pressure of constant vigilance wore down even the strongest individuals. Always watching for snipers, listening for incoming artillery, scanning for signs of enemy movement. This hypervigilance was necessary for survival, but took a tremendous toll on mental health. Yet even as soldiers found ways to cope through bonds of brotherhood and shared suffering, the sheer unpredictability of war meant that death could strike without warning or reason. You might spend weeks with a man, sharing your last cigarette, your deepest fears, your memories of home, only to watch him disappear in an instant. One moment he'd be laughing at some crude joke, the next he'd be gone, reduced to nothing more than a red stain on the earth and a pair of dog tags to send home to his mother. This randomness ate away at men's minds perhaps more than anything else. In civilian life, you could tell yourself that if you worked hard, if you were careful, if you made good choices, you'd be rewarded. You'd live to see another day. But war taught a different lesson entirely. Good men died while cowards lived. Heroes were cut down by stray bullets meant for someone else. The universe didn't care about your character, your dreams, or the people waiting for you back home. Private Johnson from Ohio learned this the hard way during the Battle of Monte Battaglia in Italy. He'd been the kind of soldier everyone respected, always volunteering for the dangerous assignments, always looking out for the new replacements. Johnson had survived Anzio, Sicily, and countless smaller engagements. He carried photos of his wife and twin daughters, showing them to anyone who'd listen. He'd made it through 2 years of combat without a scratch, and some of the men had started to think he was invincible. On October 14th, 1944, Johnson was helping to evacuate wounded men from an exposed position when an artillery shell landed nearby. It wasn't even a direct hit. A piece of shrapnel, no bigger than a man's thumb, caught him in the neck. He bled out in minutes, calling for his wife as the medics worked frantically to save him. The randomness of it, the sheer meaninglessness, broke something in the men who witnessed it. If Johnson could die like that, then anyone could. No amount of skill or courage or luck could protect you from the indifferent mathematics of war. This awareness of mortality changed how soldiers thought about everything. Time became precious in a way civilians could never understand. A hot meal wasn't just food, it was a gift. A letter from home wasn't just news, it was proof that somewhere in the world life continued to have meaning. Sleep wasn't just rest, it was an escape from the constant terror that tomorrow might be your last day on Earth. Many soldiers developed elaborate rituals and superstitions, desperate attempts to impose some sense of control on an uncontrollable situation. Some refused to shave before a battle, believing their beard would bring them luck. Others carried talismans, rabbit's feet, religious medals, or lucky coins. Sergeant Murphy from Brooklyn never took off his mother's rosary, convinced that as long as he wore it, he'd make it home alive. When he lost it during the retreat from Kasserine Pass, he spent 3 days in a state of near panic until a replacement arrived from the States. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of this randomness was how it poisoned the bonds between men. You wanted to care about your fellow soldiers, to form those connections that made life bearable, but caring made their loss so much more painful. Some men tried to protect themselves by remaining aloof, by treating their comrades as temporary acquaintances rather than brothers. But this emotional withdrawal came with its own costs, leaving them isolated and alone in the midst of thousands of other soldiers. The smart ones, the survivors, learned to walk a knife's edge between caring and detachment. They'd mourn their fallen friends, but not too deeply. They'd help new replacements, but wouldn't learn their names until they'd proven they could last more than a week. It was a brutal form of emotional triage, but it was often the only way to maintain sanity in an insane world. Food became another source of both comfort and torment for soldiers. The official rations were designed for nutrition, not pleasure. Sea rations came in cans that required a special opener, and the contents were usually some variation of beans, meat, and vegetables that had been processed into an unappetizing mush. K rations were slightly better, portable meals that included crackers, canned meat, and sometimes chocolate or cigarettes. But after months of eating the same combinations, even the best rations became monotonous. Soldiers dreamed about food almost as much as they dreamed about home. They'd spend hours describing their mother's cooking, debating the merits of different regional cuisines, or planning elaborate meals they'd eat when the war was over. These conversations served a dual purpose, providing both entertainment and a mental escape from their current circumstances. For men who might not live to see another sunrise, talking about Sunday dinners and birthday cakes was a way of keeping hope alive. When soldiers could supplement their rations with local food, it was often a revelation. Fresh bread from a French bakery, eggs from a Dutch farm, wine from an Italian vineyard. These simple pleasures took on an almost sacred quality. But obtaining such luxuries was often dangerous and always unpredictable. Foraging in occupied territory meant risking enemy fire or booby traps. Trading with locals could be complicated by language barriers, military regulations, or the simple fact that civilian populations were often as hungry as the soldiers themselves. Some enterprising soldiers became expert scroungers, able to trade cigarettes and chocolate for fresh food, warm clothing, or other necessities. These men were worth their weight in gold to their units, and their skills often meant the difference between merely surviving and actually living with some degree of comfort. But scrounging also required a certain moral flexibility, a willingness to bend rules and exploit opportunities that not every soldier possessed. The relationship between soldiers and food was further complicated by the fact that eating often had to be done under fire. Many veterans recalled the surreal experience of trying to eat a meal while artillery shells exploded nearby, or the way food would lose all taste when consumed in the immediate aftermath of combat. The body's stress response would shut down non-essential functions, making it difficult to appreciate even the best meal when you were convinced you might die at any moment. Personal hygiene became another daily struggle that civilians rarely considered. In combat situations, soldiers might go weeks without a proper bath or shower. Water was often scarce and needed for drinking rather than washing. When water was available, it was usually cold, and privacy was non-existent. Many soldiers recalled the luxury of a hot shower as one of the things they miss most about civilian life. The lack of proper hygiene had serious consequences beyond mere discomfort. Lice became endemic in many units, spreading from man to man through shared clothing and equipment. These parasites caused constant itching and could carry diseases like typhus. Soldiers would spend their rest periods picking lice from their clothes and hair, a futile exercise since reinfection was almost inevitable. Trench foot was another common ailment caused by prolonged exposure to wet and cold conditions. Feet would become swollen, discolored, and painful, sometimes leading to permanent damage or amputation. Soldiers learned to change their socks whenever possible, to dry their feet when they could, and to massage their toes to maintain circulation. But in winter combat conditions, these preventive measures were often impossible to maintain. Dental hygiene was another casualty of war. Toothbrushes were luxury items, and toothpaste was rarely available. Many soldiers would use salt, baking soda, or even sand to clean their teeth. Some units were fortunate enough to have dental officers who could provide basic care, but for most soldiers, serious dental problems had to wait until they could be evacuated to a rear area hospital. The psychological impact of these hygiene issues extended beyond physical discomfort. For men who had been raised to value cleanliness and proper grooming, the inability to maintain basic standards of personal care was deeply demoralizing. It was another way that war stripped away their civilian identities and reduced them to something more primitive and animalistic. Yet even in these degraded conditions, soldiers found ways to maintain their dignity and humanity. They'd share their last clean pair of socks with a friend. They'd help each other shave with cold water and dull razors. They'd take turns standing guard while others attempted to wash in whatever water source was available. These small acts of mutual care and consideration were essential for maintaining morale and unit cohesion. The mail system became a lifeline for soldiers, their primary connection to the world they'd left behind. Letters from home were treasured beyond measure, read and reread until they fell apart from handling. A letter could transform a soldier's entire outlook, providing proof that he was remembered and loved, that his sacrifice had meaning beyond the immediate tactical situation. But the mail system was also a source of tremendous anxiety and disappointment. Letters were often delayed for weeks or months, leaving soldiers to wonder if their loved ones were safe, if their relationships were intact, if they'd been forgotten. Worse still was the dreaded Dear John letter, informing a soldier that his girlfriend or wife had found someone else. These letters could devastate a man's morale more effectively than any enemy action. The content of letters home was carefully censored, both by military authorities and by the soldiers themselves. Men couldn't reveal their location, their unit's strength, or their future plans. They also couldn't fully describe the horrors they were witnessing, partly because of censorship rules, and partly because they didn't want to burden their families with knowledge of their suffering. This created a strange disconnect between the soldiers' reality and the version of events they shared with their loved ones. Many soldiers struggled with this necessary deception, feeling that they were becoming strangers to the people they cared about most. How could they explain the way combat had changed them to someone who had never experienced it? How could they describe the bonds they'd formed with their fellow soldiers to a wife who might feel threatened by the intensity of these relationships? The fog of war was nothing compared to the fog in a soldier's mind. By 1943, the psychological toll had become as devastating as any artillery barrage. Men who had survived Normandy or Stalingrad often found themselves staring into space for hours, their hands trembling uncontrollably as they tried to light cigarettes. The 1,000-yard stare became a common sight in field hospitals and rest areas, where hollow-eyed soldiers sat motionless, their minds still trapped in the hell they had endured. Shell shock, as it was clinically known, manifested in countless ways. Some men would dive for cover at the sound of a door slamming. Others would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat and reliving the moment when shrapnel tore through their best friend's chest. The lucky ones could still function during daylight hours, but even they carried an invisible weight that grew heavier with each passing day. The military's understanding of psychological trauma was primitive at best. Most commanders viewed mental breakdown as a failure of character rather than a legitimate casualty of war. Soldiers who couldn't cope were often branded as cowards or malingerers, adding shame to their already overwhelming burden. The prevailing attitude was that a real man should be able to handle whatever war threw at him, no matter how horrific. Medical officers struggled to treat conditions they barely understood. Some attempted to use crude forms of therapy, but most simply prescribed rest and hoped for the best. The more severe cases were shipped home or transferred to psychiatric facilities, where they faced an uncertain future with little hope of recovery. Many soldiers chose to suffer in silence rather than risk being labelled as mentally unfit for duty. The constant threat of death created a peculiar form of fatalism among the troops. Men developed superstitions and rituals that they believed would keep them alive. Some refused to shave on certain days. Others carried lucky charms or photographs of loved ones. These small acts of control provided a psychological anchor in a world where survival often seemed completely random. The randomness of death was perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of combat. A soldier could watch his closest friend get blown to pieces by a mortar round while standing just 3 feet away, completely unharmed. This arbitrary nature of violence shattered any illusion that skill, preparation, or virtue could guarantee survival. It reduced existence to pure chance, leaving men feeling helpless and insignificant in the face of industrial-scale killing. Survivor's guilt became a crushing burden for those who made it through major battles. Why had they lived when better men had died? The question haunted countless soldiers who returned home only to find themselves unable to enjoy the freedom their fallen comrades had died to secure. The guilt was often compounded by the knowledge that they had sometimes made split-second decisions that determined who lived and who died. The brotherhood forged in combat provided some psychological protection, but it also created new vulnerabilities. The deeper the bonds between soldiers, the more devastating it became when those bonds were severed by death. Men who had shared everything with their squad mates found themselves emotionally devastated when those relationships were suddenly and violently terminated. The fear of forming new attachments often left survivors isolated and emotionally numb. Combat veterans developed a cynical worldview that set them apart from civilians who had never experienced the raw brutality of war. They had seen humanity at its worst and witnessed the thin veneer of civilization stripped away under extreme stress. This knowledge created a psychological gulf between veterans and the home front that often proved impossible to bridge. Many soldiers found themselves unable to relate to people who worried about rationing or blackout curtains when they had witnessed genocide and mass slaughter. The constant state of hypervigilance required in combat took a severe toll on the nervous system. Soldiers had to remain alert for threats 24 hours a day, scanning for snipers, listening for incoming artillery, and watching for signs of enemy movement. This heightened state of awareness became so ingrained that many veterans found it impossible to relax even years after the war ended. They would automatically check exits when entering a room, sleep with weapons nearby, and react violently to unexpected sounds or movements. Sleep became both a necessity and a torment for combat soldiers. Exhaustion would eventually force even the most traumatized men to lose consciousness, but their dreams offered no escape from the horrors they had witnessed. Nightmares were universal among combat veterans, filled with vivid recreations of battles, the faces of dead comrades, and endless variations of their own deaths. Many soldiers learned to sleep in short bursts, never allowing themselves to fall into the deep sleep where the worst nightmares lurked. The psychological impact extended beyond individual trauma to affect unit cohesion and military effectiveness. As casualties mounted and veteran soldiers were lost, replacement troops found themselves surrounded by men who had already been pushed to their psychological limits. The new arrivals had to quickly adapt to the fatalistic mindset of their battle-hardened comrades or risk being ostracized as naive and dangerous. Leadership at the small unit level required an understanding of human psychology that few officers possessed. Effective sergeants and lieutenants learned to recognize the warning signs of psychological breakdown and developed informal methods for helping their men cope with extreme stress. They knew when to push soldiers beyond their apparent limits and when to provide moments of relief that could prevent complete mental collapse. The dehumanization of the enemy served as both a psychological necessity and a moral burden. Soldiers were taught to view their opponents as less than human, making it easier to kill without hesitation. But this psychological conditioning often created internal conflicts when soldiers encountered evidence of their enemy's humanity. Finding family photographs in a dead German's pocket, or hearing wounded Japanese soldiers crying for their mothers forced many Allied troops to confront the reality that they were killing men very much like themselves. Religious faith provided comfort for some soldiers, but created additional torment for others. Men who had been raised to believe in the sanctity of human life found themselves in situations where survival depended on their ability to kill efficiently and without remorse. Many struggled to reconcile their actions with their moral beliefs, leading to profound spiritual crises that lasted long after the fighting ended. The psychological preparation for combat was woefully inadequate for the realities soldiers would face. Training focused primarily on technical skills and physical conditioning, with little attention paid to the mental challenges of warfare. Most soldiers entered combat with romantic notions of heroism and glory that were quickly shattered by the brutal reality of industrial killing. The gap between expectation and reality often proved more traumatic than the actual violence itself. Communication with home became both a lifeline and a source of additional stress. Letters from loved ones provided crucial emotional support, but they also reminded soldiers of everything they were fighting to protect and might never see again. The delay in mail delivery meant that soldiers often worried about problems at home that had already been resolved, while families worried about men who might already be dead. The disconnect between the combat zone and the home front created a sense of living in two different worlds simultaneously. The transformation from civilian to killer was one of the most profound psychological changes soldiers experienced. Most men had never taken a human life before entering combat, yet they were expected to become efficient killers almost overnight. This fundamental change in identity created lasting psychological scars that affected how veterans viewed themselves and their place in society. Many struggled with questions about what they had become and whether they could ever return to their pre-war selves. Mental breakdown often occurred not during the height of combat, but during brief lulls when soldiers had time to process what they had experienced. The mind's protective mechanisms that allowed men to function under extreme stress would sometimes fail when the immediate threat was removed. This delayed reaction caught many commanders off guard and led to the mistaken belief that some soldiers were malingering or seeking to avoid combat duty. The psychological impact of witnessing atrocities was particularly devastating for Allied soldiers who discovered concentration camps or witnessed Japanese treatment of prisoners. These experiences challenged fundamental beliefs about human nature and the progress of civilization. Many soldiers found themselves unable to comprehend the systematic nature of the cruelty they observed, leading to a profound sense of disillusionment with humanity itself. The concept of moral injury emerged from soldiers' experiences of being forced to participate in or witness actions that violated their deepest ethical beliefs. Unlike physical wounds, moral injuries often worsened over time, as soldiers had years to reflect on their actions and their consequences. The knowledge that they had contributed to unspeakable destruction, even in service of a just cause, created a psychological burden that many carried for the rest of their lives. Recovery from psychological trauma was complicated by the social expectations placed on returning veterans. Society wanted its heroes to be whole and triumphant, not broken and haunted by their experiences. Many veterans felt pressure to hide their psychological wounds and pretend that they had returned unchanged from their ordeal. This forced silence often prevented healing and created a generation of men who suffered in isolation. The long-term consequences of combat stress would not be fully understood for decades after the war ended. Many veterans struggled with relationships, employment, and substance abuse as they attempted to readjust to civilian life. The psychological scars of World War II continued to affect families and communities long after the last shots were fired. creating ripple effects that influenced entire generations. The mental battlefield of World War II was as real and destructive as any physical theatre of operations. While the visible wounds healed and the physical destruction was rebuilt, the psychological damage lingered in the minds of millions of men who had been forever changed by their encounter with the absolute extremes of human experience. Disease and sickness stalked every corner of the battlefield like unseen predators, claiming lives just as ruthlessly as enemy bullets. In the cramped confines of foxholes and bunkers, where men lived for weeks without proper sanitation, dysentery spread like wildfire through entire units. Soldiers would collapse mid-charge, their bodies racked with violent cramping and dehydration, unable to distinguish between the thunder of artillery and the roar of blood in their ears. The irony was cruel beyond measure. You could survive a direct mortar attack that left your ears ringing for days, dodge sniper fire that split the air inches from your skull, and endure artillery barrages that turned the earth inside out around you, only to be felled by contaminated water or spoiled rations. Typhus, malaria, trench foot, and a dozen other maladies turned strong young men into hollow-eyed ghosts shuffling through the wasteland. Medical care, when it existed at all, was primitive and overwhelmed. Field medics worked miracles with morphine and bandages, but they were fighting a losing battle against the sheer volume of human suffering. Men died not from their wounds, but from infections that festered in the filth and chaos of war. A simple cut could become gangrenous within days, turning a minor injury into a death sentence. The psychological toll was perhaps even more devastating than the physical carnage. Shell shock, as they called it then, transformed brave soldiers into trembling shadows of their former selves. The constant bombardment didn't just assault your body, it invaded your mind, burrowing deep into your consciousness until every unexpected sound sent you diving for cover. Sleep became a luxury few could afford, and when it did come, it brought nightmares that were often worse than the waking reality. You learned to recognize the look in a man's eyes when he'd reached his breaking point. That 1,000-yard stare that meant his mind had retreated somewhere artillery couldn't reach. Some men cracked spectacularly, screaming and running toward enemy lines in a desperate bid to end their torment. Others simply stopped functioning, sitting motionless in their foxholes while battles raged around them, their minds having finally surrendered to the horror. The food, when it arrived at all, was barely fit for human consumption. Canned meat that had turned an alarming shade of green, bread so hard it could stop shrapnel, and coffee that tasted like it had been brewed with engine oil and desperation. Hunger gnawed at your belly constantly, a dull ache that never quite went away. You learned to eat anything that wouldn't immediately kill you, trading cigarettes for scraps of real food, hoarding crackers like they were precious gems. Water was even more precious than food. Clean drinking water was a fantasy in most combat zones. You drank from shell craters, puddles, and streams contaminated with the decomposing remains of men and animals. The taste of chlorine tablets became as familiar as the smell of cordite, and even then, you knew you were probably ingesting something that would make you sick later. The weather was another relentless enemy that showed no mercy to either side. Winter fighting was particularly brutal, with frostbite claiming fingers and toes with ruthless efficiency. Men huddled together for warmth, sharing body heat in foxholes that had become frozen tombs. The cold seeped into your bones, making every movement an agony, turning simple tasks like reloading a rifle into exercises in torture. Summer brought its own special torments. The stench of death became overwhelming in the heat, with bodies decomposing rapidly in the sun. Flies swarmed in black clouds, covering everything and everyone, spreading disease and madness in equal measure. The heat made wearing equipment unbearable, but removing it meant certain death if an attack came. Equipment failures were constant sources of deadly frustration. Rifles jammed at the worst possible moments. Radios died when you needed them most. And vehicles broke down in the middle of firefights. You learned to fix anything with wire, prayer, and profanity because replacement parts were as scarce as honest politicians. A malfunctioning gas mask could mean death by chemical weapons, while a broken compass could lead your entire unit into an enemy ambush. The randomness of death was perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of combat. You could follow every rule, take every precaution, and still be obliterated by a stray shell fragment. Meanwhile, the soldier next to you who seemed to have a death wish would walk through machine gun fire without a scratch. There was no logic to it, no pattern you could discern or exploit. Death was arbitrary, capricious, and absolutely final. Survivors' guilt became a crushing weight that many carried long after the war ended. Why did you live when better men died? What made you special enough to survive when your closest friends were feeding worms in foreign soil? These questions haunted veterans for decades, turning victory into a hollow, bitter thing that tasted of ashes and regret. The bonds formed between soldiers were unlike anything experienced in civilian life. When you've shared foxholes, rations, and the very real possibility of dying together, ordinary friendship becomes something transcendent. These men became your brothers in the truest sense, bound together by shared trauma and mutual dependence. Losing one of them wasn't just losing a friend, it was losing a piece of your own soul. Yet somehow, through all this brutality and suffering, the human spirit endured. Men found ways to laugh in the face of death, to maintain their humanity when everything around them had descended into barbarism. They shared photographs of sweethearts back home, told stories of better times, and clung to the hope that someday, somehow, they would return to a world where the worst thing that could happen was burning dinner or missing a train. The war changed every man who fought in it, leaving scars both visible and hidden that would never fully heal. They returned home as different people, carrying secrets and memories that civilians could never understand. The brutal winter of 1347 had given way to a cautious spring. But for the soldiers of World War II, seasons meant little when death could arrive without warning. What many don't realize is that survival on the battlefield wasn't just about dodging bullets or surviving artillery barrages. It was about navigating an intricate web of psychological warfare that could break even the strongest minds. The human psyche, you see, wasn't designed for the industrial-scale slaughter that defined World War II. While soldiers had endured the physical hardships of trenches, disease, and equipment failures, it was the mental toll that proved most devastating. The constant threat of arbitrary death created a unique form of psychological torture that military leaders were only beginning to understand. Consider the phenomenon known as battle fatigue, or what we now recognize as combat stress reaction. Soldiers would suddenly lose the ability to function, not from physical wounds, but from the sheer weight of accumulated terror. Their hands would shake uncontrollably. They'd flinch at the slightest sound. Some would stare blankly into space, completely disconnected from reality. Others would break down sobbing, unable to comprehend the horrors they'd witnessed. The randomness of survival created its own psychological burden. A soldier might watch his best friend get blown apart by a mortar shell while standing just 3 feet away, emerging without a scratch himself. This survivor's guilt ate away at men's souls like acid. Why had they lived when others died? What cosmic lottery had spared them while claiming their brothers in arms? These questions haunted soldiers long after the guns fell silent. The dehumanizing nature of modern warfare stripped away civilian morality piece by piece. Soldiers were trained to see the enemy not as fellow human beings with families and dreams, but as targets to be eliminated. This psychological conditioning was necessary for combat effectiveness, but it came at a terrible cost. Many soldiers found themselves becoming strangers to their former selves, capable of acts they never could have imagined before the war. Letters home became exercises in elaborate fiction as soldiers desperately tried to shield their loved ones from the truth of their experiences. They'd write cheerful messages about the weather or the food while sitting in muddy foxholes, surrounded by the stench of death and decay. This constant performance of normalcy created a profound sense of isolation and disconnection from the very people they were fighting to protect. The concept of thousand-yard stare became tragically familiar to those who served. It described the vacant, haunted expression that settled over veterans' faces, a look that seemed to peer through the present moment into some terrible distance that only they could see. This psychological scarring was invisible but permanent, marking survivors in ways that family members back home couldn't understand. Sleep became a luxury that few could afford, not just because of enemy action, but because of the nightmares that plagued soldiers whenever they closed their eyes. Many developed chronic insomnia, afraid to surrender consciousness and face the demons that awaited them in their dreams. When exhaustion finally overcame fear, they'd often wake screaming, reliving battles in vivid detail. The breakdown of normal social structures created its own psychological chaos. In civilian life, there were rules, expectations, and consequences that governed behavior. In combat, these frameworks collapsed entirely. Soldiers operated in a moral vacuum where the only law was survival, and this absence of familiar social norms left many feeling completely unmoored. Religious faith, which had sustained countless generations through hardship, often crumbled under the weight of what soldiers witnessed. How could a benevolent God allow such systematic cruelty and suffering? Many lost their faith entirely, while others developed a fatalistic acceptance that bordered on nihilism. Some found solace in battlefield superstitions and rituals, clinging to lucky charms or elaborate pre-mission routines that gave them the illusion of control. The psychological impact of witnessing atrocities extended beyond personal trauma to encompass what we now call moral injury. Soldiers weren't just victims of violence, they were often forced to become perpetrators. The weight of having taken human life, even in the context of war, created psychological wounds that never fully healed. Some soldiers became haunted by the faces of enemy soldiers they'd killed, seeing them in dreams and quiet moments for the rest of their lives. Communication with the outside world became a double-edged sword. While letters from home provided emotional lifelines, they also highlighted the vast gulf between the soldier's reality and civilian life. Reading about mundane concerns like school activities or work problems could trigger intense anger or despair. How could people worry about such trivial matters when the world was literally being torn apart? The constant exposure to death created a complex relationship with mortality that civilians couldn't comprehend. Some soldiers developed a reckless disregard for their own safety, taking unnecessary risks because they'd become numb to the possibility of death. Others became paralyzed by fear, unable to function effectively in combat situations. Most existed somewhere between these extremes, learning to compartmentalize their terror just enough to keep fighting. The psychological toll wasn't limited to frontline combat troops. Support personnel, medical staff, and even those in rear areas suffered their own forms of trauma. Medics watched young men die despite their best efforts. Logistics personnel handled the constant stream of casualties and equipment destroyed in battle. Radio operators listened to desperate pleas for help that they couldn't answer. Post-traumatic stress, though not yet understood or officially recognized, manifested in countless ways. Veterans would return home physically intact, but emotionally shattered, unable to readjust to civilian life. They'd startle at unexpected noises, struggle with authority figures, or find themselves unable to form close relationships. Many turned to alcohol or other substances to numb the psychological pain that never seemed to fade. The psychological warfare extended beyond individual trauma to encompass the broader social fabric of military units. Trust became both essential and fragile. Soldiers depended absolutely on their comrades for survival. Yet they also lived with the knowledge that anyone could break under pressure. The bonds formed in combat were intensely powerful, but they existed alongside the constant fear of loss and betrayal. This mental battlefield was perhaps the most brutal aspect of World War II soldiering, leaving scars that would define veterans for the rest of their lives. The journey from the battle-scarred fields of Europe to the uncertain peace that followed brought its own unique torment for soldiers who had witnessed the unthinkable. While the guns had finally fallen silent, the war's echoes reverberated endlessly through the minds and souls of those who survived. The transition from warrior to civilian proved to be yet another battlefield, one where the enemy was invisible, but no less deadly. For many soldiers, the end of hostilities marked not a return to normalcy, but the beginning of a different kind of struggle. The men who stumbled off transport ships and trains bore little resemblance to the eager young recruits who had marched away years earlier. Their eyes held a haunted quality that spoke of horrors beyond civilian comprehension. Their hands trembled, not from cold, but from memories that refused to fade. Their sleep, when it came at all, was fractured by nightmares that transported them back to muddy trenches and burning cities. The concept of what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder was barely understood during and immediately after World War II. Shell shock, battle fatigue, combat exhaustion. These were the crude terms used to describe conditions that defied easy categorization. Medical professionals of the era often viewed psychological wounds as signs of weakness or cowardice, leaving countless veterans to suffer in silence. The prevailing attitude was that real men simply got on with life, that dwelling on wartime experiences was self-indulgent and unpatriotic. This cultural dismissal of mental anguish created a secondary trauma for returning soldiers. Not only were they grappling with their own psychological demons, but they were also expected to seamlessly reintegrate into a society that had moved on without them. Families had adapted to their absence. Women had entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, and the home front had developed its own rhythms and routines that didn't necessarily include space for damaged warriors. The homecoming experience varied dramatically depending on which side of the conflict soldiers had fought for. American and British veterans often returned to ticker-tape parades and grateful communities, yet even these heroes struggled with the disconnect between public adulation and private anguish. How could they explain to cheering crowds that victory felt hollow when so many friends lay buried in foreign soil? How could they articulate the guilt of survival when better men had perished? For German, Italian, and Japanese soldiers, the return home was even more complicated. These men faced not only their own psychological wounds, but also the collective shame of defeat and the moral reckoning with the regimes they had served. Many returned to find their cities reduced to rubble, their families displaced or dead, their entire worldview shattered. The weight of complicity in their nation's crimes added another layer of trauma that would take generations to process. Soviet soldiers faced their own unique challenges upon returning home. Despite their nation's ultimate victory, many found themselves viewed with suspicion by Stalin's paranoid regime. Those who had been prisoners of war were often treated as potential traitors, subjected to interrogation, and in many cases, sent to gulags. The very fact of having survived captivity was seen as evidence of collaboration with the enemy. This betrayal by their own government added a bitter twist to an already difficult homecoming. The physical aftermath of war compounded the psychological challenges. Medical technology, while advanced compared to previous conflicts, still left many veterans with permanent disabilities. Prosthetic limbs were crude and uncomfortable. Reconstructive surgery was primitive, and pain management was rudimentary. Men who had once prided themselves on their physical strength and capability found themselves dependent on others for basic functions. The loss of identity that came with physical disability was often as devastating as the disability itself. Veterans struggled to find their place in rapidly changing economies. Military skills didn't always translate to civilian employment, and many found themselves competing for jobs with workers who had spent the war years gaining experience in peacetime industries. The GI Bill in the United States provided educational opportunities for many American veterans, but similar programs were not available to soldiers from other nations. For many, economic hardship became another source of stress and anxiety in their already difficult adjustment period. Family relationships bore the strain of these challenges. Wives who had managed households independently for years now had to readjust to their husband's return, often finding that the men who came back were strangers wearing familiar faces. Children who had grown up without fathers struggled to accept these distant, sometimes volatile figures into their lives. Divorce rates spiked in the immediate post-war years as couples discovered that love alone wasn't enough to bridge the chasm created by years of separation and trauma. The coping mechanisms available to veterans were limited and often destructive. Alcohol became a common form of self-medication, offering temporary escape from memories that refused to fade. The culture of drinking that had been part of military life continued into civilian existence, but without the camaraderie and structure that had once contained it. Many veterans found themselves trapped in cycles of drinking and depression that destroyed relationships and derailed careers. Some veterans channeled their experiences into creative expression, producing literature, art, and films that helped society begin to understand the true cost of war. Writers like Norman Mailer, James Jones, and Kurt Vonnegut drew directly from their combat experiences to create works that captured the surreal horror and dark humor of warfare. These artistic expressions served not only as personal therapy for their creators, but also as bridges of understanding between veterans and civilians. Others found solace in veteran organizations and informal networks of former soldiers. The shared understanding that existed between men who had faced similar horrors provided a form of support that civilian society couldn't offer. These groups became lifelines for many, offering practical assistance with employment and benefits, while also providing emotional support from those who truly understood the invisible wounds of war. The impact of wartime trauma extended far beyond the veterans themselves, affecting their children and grandchildren in ways that are only now being fully understood. The concept of intergenerational trauma, the idea that traumatic experiences can be passed down through families, was not recognized during the immediate post-war period. Children of veterans often grew up in households shadowed by their father's unprocessed trauma, inheriting patterns of emotional distance, hypervigilance, and difficulty with intimacy. Many veterans struggled with survivor's guilt that colored every aspect of their post-war lives. They questioned why they had lived when so many others had died, often feeling unworthy of the second chance they had been given. This guilt manifested in various ways. Some drove themselves relentlessly in their careers, as if trying to justify their survival through achievement, while others withdrew from life entirely, unable to embrace opportunities that their fallen comrades would never have. The randomness of war's brutality had shattered many veterans' faith in justice, fairness, and divine providence. Men who had witnessed the best and worst of humanity struggled to reconcile these extremes with their pre-war beliefs about the nature of good and evil. Some found renewed faith through their experiences, viewing their survival as evidence of divine protection, while others lost their faith entirely, unable to believe in a benevolent God who would allow such suffering. Sleep became a battlefield for many veterans. as nightmares transported them back to moments of terror and loss. The boundary between sleeping and waking became blurred, with flashbacks intruding into daily life without warning. Simple sounds, a car backfiring, a door slamming, a child crying, could trigger intense physiological responses that left veterans feeling vulnerable and out of control. This hypervigilance, which had been essential for survival in combat, became a liability in civilian life. The medical establishment's understanding of trauma slowly evolved in the decades following the war, but progress was painfully slow for those suffering in the immediate aftermath. Many veterans went years or even decades without proper treatment for their psychological wounds. The stigma associated with mental health issues prevented many from seeking help, while the limited understanding of trauma meant that even those who did seek treatment often received inadequate care. Women veterans faced additional challenges in their post-war adjustment. The contributions of military nurses, resistance fighters, and support personnel were often overlooked in the narrative of heroic homecoming. These women had witnessed the same horrors as their male counterparts, but were expected to return seamlessly to traditional domestic roles. The trauma they carried was doubly invisible. First, because it was psychological rather than physical, and second, because society was even less prepared to acknowledge that women could be wounded by war. The economic boom that followed the war in many Allied nations created a strange disconnect for veterans struggling with trauma. While society celebrated prosperity and progress, many former soldiers felt left behind, unable to participate fully in the optimism that characterized the era. The contrast between public celebration and private anguish created additional isolation for those already struggling to find their place in the post-war world. As the immediate post-war years gave way to the 1950s and beyond, patterns emerged in how different societies dealt with their returning veterans. Some nations developed more comprehensive support systems, while others largely ignored the problem, hoping it would resolve itself with time. The Cold War created new anxieties and divisions that complicated the process of healing, as former allies became enemies and old certainties crumbled. The legacy of World War II's psychological toll continues to influence our understanding of war's impact on the human psyche. The veterans who struggled in silence during those early post-war years paved the way for better recognition and treatment of combat trauma in subsequent conflicts. Their suffering was not in vain if it helps us better support the warriors of today and tomorrow. The stories of these forgotten battles, fought not with weapons but with memories, not on foreign soil but in the privacy of bedrooms and family kitchens, remind us that the true cost of war extends far beyond the battlefield. The young men who marched away to fight for freedom, democracy, and their nation's survival paid a price that many are still paying today. Their invisible wounds may have healed with time, or they may have been passed down to children and grandchildren who continue to grapple with the echoes of a war they never fought. In recognizing their struggle, we honor not only their service in combat, but also their courage in facing the long battle that followed. The weight of war settled into the bones of every soldier, like a permanent ache that no amount of rest could cure. By the time most men reached this point in their service, they had witnessed horrors that would haunt them for whatever remained of their lives. The clean-cut recruits who had marched off to war with songs on their lips and dreams of glory in their hearts were long gone, replaced by hollow-eyed survivors who moved through each day with the mechanical precision of the walking dead. Sleep became an elusive luxury, not just because of the constant threat of enemy action, but because of what waited in the darkness behind closed eyelids. The faces of fallen comrades appeared with startling clarity in dreams that felt more real than waking life. The sounds of artillery bombardments echoed in phantom thunder that could strike without warning, sending battle-hardened veterans diving for cover at the rumble of a passing truck. Every shadow might conceal an enemy sniper, every unexpected sound could signal the beginning of another assault. The psychological toll of constant vigilance was perhaps more devastating than the physical hardships. Men learned to sleep with one eye open, to eat while scanning for threats, to relieve themselves while keeping their weapons within arm's reach. Trust became a precious commodity doled out sparingly, because betrayal on the battlefield meant death not just for oneself, but for every man in the unit. The bonds forged in combat were simultaneously the strongest and most fragile connections these soldiers would ever know. Food, when it came, was often spoiled or barely edible. Rations designed to provide basic nutrition bore little resemblance to actual meals, and fresh provisions were rare luxuries that appeared irregularly and disappeared quickly. Men learned to eat anything that might provide sustenance, overcoming revulsion born of upbringing and civilization. Hunger gnawed at empty bellies with a persistence that made concentration difficult and decision-making cloudy. The simple act of sharing a piece of stale bread or a sip of clean water became profound gestures of brotherhood that transcended rank and background. Water was another constant concern. Clean drinking water was often scarce, forcing soldiers to make desperate choices between risking disease from contaminated sources or facing the dehydration that would leave them vulnerable in combat. Many learned to purify water using whatever methods they could devise. But stomach ailments and dysentery were common afflictions that could disable a fighting man as effectively as enemy bullets. The medical care available to wounded soldiers was primitive by any standard, hampered by shortages of supplies, trained personnel, and basic sanitary conditions. Field hospitals were often little more than tents or commandeered buildings where overworked medics performed triage with heartbreaking efficiency. The walking wounded were patched up and sent back to the front lines, while those with more serious injuries faced uncertain prospects for recovery. Pain medication was scarce and reserved for the most severe cases, leaving many to endure their suffering in stoic silence. Infections claimed as many lives as enemy action, turning minor wounds into fatal conditions. The lack of antibiotics meant that even small cuts could become septic, and surgery performed under battlefield conditions often did more harm than good. Amputation was sometimes the only option for saving a life, but the psychological trauma of losing a limb often proved as debilitating as the physical disability. Men who had defined themselves by their physical capabilities suddenly found themselves dependent on others for the most basic tasks. The climate and environment added another layer of misery to an already unbearable situation. In the Pacific Theatre, soldiers battled not only Japanese forces, but also tropical diseases, poisonous insects, and suffocating humidity that made every movement exhausting. Malaria, dengue fever, and other mosquito-borne illnesses decimated units faster than enemy bullets. The jungle itself became an adversary, concealing dangers both human and natural, while providing perfect cover for ambushes and surprise attacks. In the European theatre, bitter winters brought their own special torments. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes with ruthless efficiency, while trenchfoot turned feet into rotting masses of infected flesh. The cold penetrated through every layer of clothing, making sleep impossible and movement painful. Men huddled together for warmth, sharing body heat and what little fuel they could find for fires that had to be kept small to avoid attracting enemy attention. Equipment failures added unpredictability to an already chaotic environment. Weapons jammed at critical moments, leaving soldiers defensively vulnerable. Radios failed when communication was most crucial, cutting units off from support and coordination. Vehicles broke down in hostile territory, stranding their occupants far from friendly lines. The mechanical devices that were supposed to provide advantages in warfare often became liabilities when they malfunctioned at the worst possible moments. The randomness of death on the battlefield created a psychological environment where nothing made sense, and survival seemed to depend more on luck than skill or courage. A soldier could perform heroically in one engagement only to be killed by a stray shell while eating breakfast the next morning. Men who had survived dozens of combat missions would die from accidents or friendly fire, while others who seemed constantly in harm's way would emerge unscathed from the most dangerous situations. This randomness eroded faith in justice, fairness, and the notion that good deeds would be rewarded while evil would be punished. Soldiers watched as the bravest and most decent men in their units were cut down while cowards and bullies seemed to lead charmed lives. The arbitrary nature of battlefield death created a worldview where traditional moral frameworks collapsed under the weight of experience that contradicted everything these men had been taught about how the world worked. The noise of warfare was a constant assault on the senses that went far beyond simple loudness. Artillery bombardments created sound levels that could cause permanent hearing damage, while the concussive effects of explosions rattled teeth, disrupted vision, and left men disoriented and confused. The crack of rifle fire, the chatter of machine guns, and the whistle of incoming mortar rounds created a symphony of violence that played continuously in the background of every waking moment. Even in supposedly quiet periods, the anticipation of renewed combat kept nerves on edge. The absence of gunfire could be more unnerving than its presence, because silence might indicate that the enemy was preparing for an attack or moving into position for an ambush. Every sound had to be analysed and categorised as either threatening or benign, a process that required constant attention and left little mental energy for other activities. The smell of war was equally assaultive and unforgettable. Cordite and gunpowder mixed with the stench of unwashed bodies, rotting food, and human waste to create an olfactory environment that was both nauseating and oddly familiar. The sweet, sickening smell of decomposing corpses was perhaps the most traumatic sensory memory that veterans carried with them, a scent that could trigger flashbacks and panic attacks years after the war had ended. Personal hygiene became impossible to maintain under combat conditions. Men went weeks without bathing, their clothes becoming stiff with sweat, dirt, and blood. Dental care was non-existent, leading to tooth decay and gum disease that added to the general misery of daily existence. Shaving was a luxury that few could afford, both in terms of time and resources, leading to scraggly beards that itched and harboured insects. The accumulation of filth was more than just uncomfortable. It was a breeding ground for disease and infection. Lice and other parasites found ideal conditions in the unwashed clothing and bodies of soldiers, spreading rapidly through units and creating additional health problems that weakened fighting effectiveness. The simple act of scratching became an obsessive behaviour that could distract from important tasks and leave visible marks that indicated a unit's poor living conditions. Sleep deprivation was another constant companion that affected every aspect of a soldier's performance and well-being. Combat operations rarely followed normal schedules, with attacks coming at all hours and requiring immediate response regardless of how long it had been since the last rest period. Men learned to sleep in short bursts whenever opportunity presented itself, often while standing or sitting in uncomfortable positions that provided little actual rest. The quality of sleep, when it came, was poor due to stress, noise, and uncomfortable conditions. Nightmares were common, often featuring replay of traumatic events or premonitions of future disasters. Many soldiers developed chronic insomnia that persisted long after the war ended, their nervous systems having become so accustomed to hypervigilance that relaxation became impossible. The psychological defense mechanisms that soldiers developed to cope with these conditions often came at a steep price. Emotional numbing that helped men function in combat also made it difficult to experience positive emotions like joy, love, or hope. The black humour that provided relief from stress could become so ingrained that it interfered with normal social interactions after the war. The hypervigilance that kept soldiers alive on the battlefield could make peaceful civilian life feel threatening and alien, Many men found that they had lost the ability to relate to people who had not shared their experiences. The concerns and complaints of civilians seemed trivial compared to the life and death struggles of combat, creating a gulf between veterans and the society they had fought to protect. Relationships with family members and friends became strained as both sides struggled to bridge the gap between wartime and peacetime experiences. The moral injuries sustained in combat were often more lasting than physical wounds. Men were forced to make split-second decisions that violated their deepest beliefs about right and wrong, sometimes killing enemy soldiers who were barely more than children, or watching helplessly as civilians became caught in the crossfire. The weight of these compromises accumulated over time, creating a burden of guilt and shame that could not be easily shared. Some soldiers found themselves questioning everything they had previously believed about human nature, justice, and the meaning of life. The patriotic fervor that had motivated their enlistment seemed naive and foolish in light of what they had witnessed and done. The noble cause they had enlisted to serve became obscured by the brutal realities of combat, leaving them wondering whether their sacrifices had been worthwhile. Yet even in the midst of this comprehensive breakdown of normal human experience, something remarkable often emerged. The bonds formed between soldiers who had shared these extremes of suffering became deeper and more meaningful than any relationships most of them had ever known. Men who might never have spoken to each other in civilian life became brothers in the truest sense, willing to sacrifice their own lives to protect their comrades. These relationships were built on absolute trust and mutual dependence. Each man knew that his survival depended not only on his own actions, but on the reliability and competence of every other member of his unit. This interdependence created a form of intimacy that transcended normal social boundaries, allowing men to show vulnerability and tenderness that would have been impossible in peacetime society. The shared experience of extreme adversity also revealed reserves of strength and resilience that surprised even the soldiers themselves. Men discovered that they could endure physical and emotional trauma that would have seemed impossible before the war. They learned to function effectively while exhausted, terrified, and in pain, developing capabilities they never knew they possessed. Human adaptability proved to be both blessing and curse in these circumstances. The same psychological flexibility that allowed soldiers to survive in combat also made it possible for them to normalize experiences that should have been intolerable. Men learned to step over corpses without thinking, to eat while surrounded by carnage, and to sleep through artillery bombardments that would have terrified them just months earlier. This adaptation came at a cost that would only become apparent later. The ability to disconnect from normal human emotions and reactions, while essential for survival in combat, made it difficult to reconnect with those emotions when they were needed for healing and recovery. Veterans often found themselves trapped between two worlds, unable to fully return to civilian life, but also unable to remain in the military environment that had shaped them so profoundly. The experience of combat revealed both the worst and best aspects of human nature with stark clarity. Soldiers witnessed acts of cowardice, cruelty, and selfishness that challenged their faith in humanity. But they also saw examples of courage, compassion, and self-sacrifice that affirmed the nobility of the human spirit. These contradictions existed not only between different individuals, but often within the same person, as circumstances brought out different aspects of character at different times. The randomness and chaos of warfare created situations where traditional measures of worth and value became meaningless. A soldier's education, social status, or civilian accomplishments meant nothing when bullets were flying. Survival depended on qualities that were impossible to predict or measure in advance. The ability to remain calm under pressure, to make good decisions quickly, to trust and be trusted by others, and to maintain hope in the face of overwhelming evidence that hope was futile. For many soldiers, the war became a transformative experience that fundamentally altered their understanding of themselves and their place in the world. They discovered capabilities they never knew they had, both for endurance and for violence. They learned that they could kill other human beings when necessary, but also that they could risk their lives to save strangers. These discoveries were often difficult to integrate into their post-war identities, creating internal conflicts that persisted for decades. The brutal realities of World War II combat created a generation of veterans who had been marked by experiences that were almost impossible to communicate to those who had not shared them. Their attempts to readjust to civilian life were complicated by the fact that the skills and attitudes that had kept them alive in combat were often counterproductive in peacetime society. The hypervigilance that had been essential on the battlefield became paranoia in suburban neighborhoods. The emotional numbing that had allowed them to function in combat made it difficult to connect with family members who needed their love and attention. Many veterans struggled with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, though at the time there was little understanding of the psychological wounds of war. They were expected to simply return to their pre-war lives as if nothing had happened, despite the fact that they had been fundamentally changed by their experiences. The stoic ideal of the strong, silent veteran who didn't complain about his service made it difficult for many to seek help or even acknowledge that they needed it. The physical scars of war were visible and could be treated with medical intervention, but the psychological and spiritual wounds were often invisible and untreatable with the limited resources available at the time. Veterans learned to carry their pain silently, creating a facade of normalcy that concealed the ongoing struggle to make sense of what they had experienced and done. The brutal life of a World War II soldier encompassed every aspect of human experience compressed into its most extreme forms. These men faced deprivation, terror, pain, and moral compromise on a scale that challenged the limits of human endurance. Yet they also experienced brotherhood, purpose, and moments of transcendence that revealed the extraordinary potential of the human spirit under pressure. Their legacy extends far beyond the military victories they achieved or the territories they liberated. They demonstrated that ordinary people could rise to meet extraordinary challenges, that the human capacity for both suffering and resilience was greater than anyone had imagined, and that the bonds forged in extreme adversity could become the foundation for lifelong relationships of uncommon depth and meaning. The cost of these achievements was measured not only in the lives lost on battlefields around the world, but in the lasting wounds carried by those who survived. Part 9. The Weight of Brotherhood. Bonds Forged in Fire. When we speak of the brutal life of a World War II soldier, we often focus on the physical horrors, the deafening artillery, the gnawing hunger, the bone-deep cold that seemed to freeze your very soul. But there was another element to their suffering, one that paradoxically became their greatest source of strength. It was the weight of brotherhood, the unbreakable bonds forged in the crucible of war that would define these men long after the guns fell silent. You see, in the midst of all that chaos and carnage, something extraordinary happened. Men who had never met before, who came from different states, different backgrounds, different walks of life entirely, found themselves bound together by something deeper than blood. They became brothers in the truest sense of the word, united not by birth, but by the shared experience of hell on earth. Picture this for a moment. You're 19 years old, maybe 20 if you're lucky. You've been ripped away from everything you've ever known, everything that gave your life meaning, your mother's cooking, your girlfriend's letters, the familiar streets of your hometown. All of that is gone, replaced by mud and misery and the constant threat of death. In that vacuum, in that complete absence of everything normal and good, these men became everything to each other. They shared their last cigarettes when tobacco was scarce. They split their meager rations even when their own stomachs were cramping with hunger. They carried wounded comrades on their backs for miles, even when their own legs could barely hold them up. They wrote letters home for buddies who couldn't read or write, and they held dying friends in their arms, whispering lies about how everything was going to be okay. This wasn't just friendship. This was something forged in fire, tempered by suffering, and strengthened by the knowledge that the man next to you was the only thing standing between you and complete despair. When Private Johnson from Arkansas shared his last chocolate bar with Corporal Schmidt from Wisconsin, it wasn't just generosity. It was an act of survival, a recognition that they were all in this together, that their fates were intertwined in ways that civilians back home could never understand. The bonds formed in foxholes and trenches became sacred. These men developed their own language, their own rituals, their own code of honor that transcended anything they'd learned in training. They knew each other's fears, each other's dreams, each other's deepest secrets. They could read each other's moods in the dark, could sense danger in the way a buddy held his rifle, could offer comfort with nothing more than a shared look across a battlefield. But here's what made it truly brutal. These bonds came with a terrible price. The deeper the connection, the more devastating the loss when it was severed. And in war, those connections were severed constantly, violently, without warning or mercy. Imagine watching your best friend, the guy who'd shared every meal with you for months, who knew your mother's name and your dog's favorite trick. Imagine watching him step on a mine and simply disappear in a cloud of smoke and shrapnel. Imagine holding the hand of a buddy who'd pulled you out of a burning tank, feeling his grip grow weaker as the life ebbed out of him, knowing there was nothing you could do to save him. The weight of these losses was crushing. Each death didn't just rob the unit of a soldier, it tore away a piece of every man who survived. They carried the guilt of survival, the agonizing question of why they were still breathing when better men lay cold in the ground. They carried the promises they'd made to dying friends, the letters they'd sworn to deliver, the stories they'd vowed to tell. Some men collected the dog tags of fallen comrades, wearing them around their necks like a rosary of grief. Others kept photographs, small mementos, anything to hold onto the memory of brothers who'd been lost. They made promises to visit families after the war, to look after wives and children, to make sure the sacrifice meant something. The psychological impact of these losses was staggering. Men who'd been hardened by months of combat would break down completely when a particular friend was killed. They'd seen hundreds die, maybe thousands. But this one death, this one loss, would shatter something inside them that could never be fully repaired. Unit cohesion became everything. A squad that had been together for months, that had learned to function as a single organism, could be devastated by the loss of key members. New replacements, no matter how well trained, were viewed with suspicion, even hostility. It wasn't personal. It was protection. These veterans had learned the terrible cost of caring too much, too quickly. They developed dark humor as a defense mechanism, joking about death and injury in ways that would shock civilians. They created nicknames for each other that stuck for life, shorthand references to shared experiences that only they could understand. They established traditions and superstitions, little rituals that helped them feel some measure of control in an uncontrollable world. The mail from home became a lifeline, but also a source of torment. Letters that took weeks to arrive brought news that was often outdated or irrelevant to their current reality. Some men stopped writing entirely, unable to bridge the gap between the world they'd left behind and the hell they now inhabited. Others wrote constantly, pouring their hearts out in letters they knew could never capture the full truth of their experience. And through it all, they held each other up. When one man's nerve started to crack, his buddies would cover for him, give him space to recover, make sure he didn't do anything that would get him court-martialed or killed. When someone received devastating news from home, the whole unit would rally around him, offering whatever comfort they could. these bonds extended beyond national boundaries too. American soldiers formed unexpected friendships with British, Canadian, and Australian troops. They shared stories, compared notes on combat techniques, and found common ground in their shared suffering. Language barriers meant nothing when you were all facing the same enemy, the same fear, the same possibility of death. The brutality of these relationships lay not just in their intensity, but in their fragility. In war, nothing was permanent except the memory of what you'd lost. Units were broken up and reformed constantly. Men were transferred, promoted, wounded, or killed without warning. The family you'd built in the trenches could be scattered to the winds in a matter of hours. Veterans would spend the rest of their lives searching for this kind of connection again, this depth of understanding and mutual dependence. Civilian relationships, no matter how loving, often felt shallow by comparison. How do you explain to your wife that you trust your war buddy with your life, but you can't trust her to understand what you went through? How do you tell your children that the men you served with knew you better than your own family ever could? The reunions that followed the war were both joyous and heartbreaking. Men would travel thousands of miles to see old comrades, to share stories and memories that no one else could appreciate. But they were also reminders of all those who wouldn't be coming to any reunion, all the empty spaces at the table where friends should have been sitting. This brotherhood of suffering created a code that lasted long after the war ended. Veterans would help each other find jobs, start businesses, deal with the nightmares and flashbacks that plagued their sleep. They formed organizations and clubs, not just for social reasons, but because only another veteran could truly understand what they'd been through. The weight of these bonds shaped every aspect of their post-war lives. They named their children after fallen comrades. They visited the graves of friends whenever they could. They carried the stories of the dead, keeping their memory alive through decades of retelling. In a very real sense, they spent the rest of their lives serving not just their country, but the memory of the men who didn't make it home. This was perhaps the most brutal aspect of the World War II soldiers' experience, not just the physical suffering, not just the psychological trauma, but the knowledge that they'd experienced a depth of human connection that could never be replicated in peacetime. They'd found their brothers in the worst possible circumstances, and they'd lost too many of them in ways too terrible to fully comprehend. But it was also their salvation. In the darkest moments, when hope seemed impossible and survival looked unlikely, it was these bonds that kept them going. Not patriotism, not ideology, not even the desire to go home. It was the knowledge that their buddies were counting on them, that they couldn't let their brothers down, that they had to honor the sacrifice of those who'd already fallen. The brutal life of a World War II soldier was made bearable, if not survivable, by the brotherhood forged in fire. The harrowing realities of World War II had already tested the limits of human endurance through countless battles, bombings, and the grinding machinery of total war. Yet for those who survived the initial waves of combat, a new and perhaps even more insidious enemy began to emerge from the shadows of their own minds. The psychological wounds inflicted by prolonged exposure to violence and death would prove to be just as devastating as any physical injury, creating scars that would last decades beyond the war's end. As the conflict dragged on month after month, year after year, soldiers found themselves trapped in a nightmarish cycle that went far beyond the immediate terror of battle. The human mind, no matter how resilient, was never designed to witness the systematic destruction of civilization itself. Every dawn brought fresh horrors, every sunset another day of survival against impossible odds. The very fabric of sanity began to unravel under the relentless pressure of industrialized warfare, the phenomenon that military psychiatrists would eventually term battle fatigue or combat exhaustion was far more complex than simple fear or cowardice. These men had already proven their courage time and again, charging machine gun nests, enduring artillery barrages that could be heard for miles, and watching their closest friends die in ways that defied human comprehension. What they were experiencing was the complete breakdown of the psychological defense mechanisms that normally allow people to function in civilized society. Shell shock, as it was commonly known, manifested in countless ways. Some soldiers would freeze completely in the middle of combat, their bodies simply refusing to obey their mind's commands. Others would begin shaking uncontrollably, their hands trembling so violently they couldn't hold a rifle or light a cigarette. Many lost the ability to speak coherently, their words coming out as stutters and stammers that bore no resemblance to their former eloquence. The lucky ones merely suffered from nightmares that would wake them screaming in the middle of the night, drenched in cold sweat and unable to distinguish between dream and reality. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of psychological trauma was how it isolated soldiers from the very people they were fighting to protect. How could a man explain to his wife or mother what it felt like to bayonet another human being? How could he describe the sound that a person makes when they realize they're about to die? The gulf between the battlefield and the home front was so vast that many soldiers felt they were living in two completely different worlds, unable to bridge the gap between the horror they had witnessed and the normal life they were supposed to return to. The military medical establishment of the time was woefully unprepared to deal with these psychological casualties. Many officers viewed shell shock as a form of malingering or cowardice, leading to soldiers being court-martialed or shot for desertion when they were actually suffering from severe mental trauma. The few doctors who recognized it as a legitimate medical condition had little understanding of how to treat it effectively. Some prescribed rest and relaxation. Others recommended immediate return to combat to prevent the fear from taking root. Most simply hoped the symptoms would disappear on their own. For soldiers experiencing these symptoms, the lack of understanding from their superiors and comrades added another layer of suffering to their already unbearable burden. They knew something was fundamentally wrong with them, but they had no framework for understanding what was happening to their minds. Many began to believe they were going insane, that the war had broken something essential inside them that could never be repaired. This self-doubt and shame often proved more destructive than the original trauma, creating a downward spiral that could last for years. The concept of survivor's guilt emerged as one of the most pervasive and destructive forms of psychological damage. Soldiers who lived through battles that claimed the lives of their friends and comrades often found themselves asking the same torturous question over and over again. Why did I survive when they didn't? This guilt was compounded by the arbitrary nature of death in modern warfare, where a shell could land 2 feet to the left or right and determine who lived and who died. The randomness of survival made it impossible for soldiers to find any meaning or logic in their continued existence. Hypervigilance became another common symptom that would follow veterans long after the war ended. After months or years of needing to be constantly alert for snipers, booby traps, and surprise attacks, their nervous systems became permanently stuck in a state of high alert. The sound of a car backfiring could send them diving for cover. The sight of smoke rising from a chimney could trigger flashbacks to burning cities, and the smell of certain foods could transport them instantly back to the battlefield. Their minds had been rewired for survival in a hostile environment, but this rewiring made it nearly impossible to relax and enjoy peaceful civilian life. The phenomenon of emotional numbing represented another cruel adaptation to the horrors of war. After witnessing so much death and destruction, many soldiers found that their capacity for feeling anything at all had simply shut down. They could no longer experience joy, love, or even basic human connection in the way they had before the war. This emotional flatness served as a protective mechanism during combat, preventing them from being overwhelmed by the constant stream of traumatic experiences. But it also cut them off from the positive emotions that make life worth living. leaving them feeling like hollow shells of their former selves. Nightmares and flashbacks became the most visible symptoms of what we now understand as post-traumatic stress disorder. These weren't simple bad dreams, but vivid recreations of traumatic events that felt more real than reality itself. Veterans would find themselves suddenly transported back to the battlefield in the middle of ordinary activities, experiencing the sights, sounds, and smells of combat with such intensity that they lost all awareness of their present surroundings. These episodes could be triggered by seemingly innocuous stimuli, making normal life feel like a minefield, where any step might detonate an explosion of unwanted memories. The impact of psychological trauma extended far beyond the individual soldier to affect entire families and communities. Wives found themselves married to strangers who bore little resemblance to the men they had sent off to war. Children grew up with fathers who were physically present but emotionally absent, unable to form the deep connections that healthy family relationships require. The ripple effects of wartime trauma would echo through generations, as the children of traumatized veterans often struggled with their own psychological issues, despite never having experienced combat themselves. Perhaps most tragically, the very qualities that made someone an effective soldier often became liabilities in civilian life. The aggression and quick reflexes that kept a man alive in combat could make him dangerous and unpredictable in peaceful settings. The loyalty and brotherhood that sustained military units could leave veterans feeling isolated and misunderstood when they returned to a society that had no equivalent bonds. The sense of purpose and mission that gave meaning to military service often disappeared entirely in civilian life, leaving veterans feeling adrift and purposeless. The long-term consequences of this psychological damage would become apparent only in the decades following the war. Many veterans struggled with alcoholism and drug abuse as they attempted to self-medicate their symptoms. Suicide rates among former soldiers remained elevated for years after the conflict ended. Divorce rates soared as marriages crumbled under the weight of untreated trauma. Employment became difficult for men who couldn't concentrate, couldn't sleep, and couldn't trust their own emotional reactions. Yet perhaps the most insidious aspect of psychological trauma was how it remained largely invisible to the outside world. A soldier with a missing limb or visible scars could expect sympathy and understanding from civilians, but a veteran whose wounds were hidden inside his mind often faced skepticism, judgment, and accusations of weakness. Society wanted its heroes to return triumphant and whole, not broken and struggling. This lack of recognition and support made recovery even more difficult and added shame to an already overwhelming burden of suffering. The coping mechanisms that soldiers developed to deal with their trauma were often destructive, but understandable given the circumstances. Some threw themselves into work with manic intensity, using constant activity to avoid confronting their inner demons. Others withdrew completely from social interaction, finding human contact too overwhelming and unpredictable. Many developed elaborate rituals and routines that gave them a sense of control in a world that felt chaotic and dangerous. These adaptations might have provided temporary relief, but they often prevented the deep healing that was necessary for true recovery. As medical understanding slowly evolved, it became clear that the psychological casualties of World War II represented a fundamental challenge to how society thought about mental health and human resilience. The sheer scale of the problem, with millions of veterans affected to some degree, made it impossible to dismiss as individual weakness or moral failing. The war had conducted a massive, involuntary experiment on the human psyche, and the results were both sobering and transformative for the field of psychology. The impact of psychological trauma also varied significantly based on the type of combat experience a soldier had endured. Those who served in the Pacific Theater often developed different symptoms than their counterparts in Europe, reflecting the unique horrors of jungle warfare and the cultural differences they encountered. bomber crews faced their own particular psychological challenges, flying mission after mission, knowing that their survival was largely a matter of statistics. Tank crews dealt with the claustrophobic terror of being trapped in a metal box that could become their coffin at any moment. For many soldiers, the transition from the intense brotherhood of military service to the isolation of civilian life proved to be one of the most difficult aspects of their psychological recovery. In combat, they had been part of something larger than themselves, bound together by shared danger and mutual dependence. The loss of this intense connection often left veterans feeling more alone than they had ever felt in their lives, even when surrounded by family and friends who loved them. The psychological wounds of World War II would eventually lead to significant advances in our understanding of trauma and its treatment. But for the generation that fought the war, this knowledge came too late to prevent decades of unnecessary suffering. They had sacrificed not only their youth and innocence, but also their psychological well-being for the cause of freedom. The brutal reality of a World War II soldier's existence extended far beyond the battlefield, seeping into the very bones of those who survived long enough to glimpse peace. For the men who had endured years of mechanized slaughter, who had watched their closest friends torn apart by artillery shells, who had learned to sleep through the screams of the wounded, the transition back to civilian life proved to be perhaps the cruelest battle of all. These warriors returned home carrying invisible wounds that would never fully heal. They had been forged in the crucible of industrial warfare, transformed into killing machines capable of extraordinary violence and endurance. But the very adaptations that had kept them alive in combat now made them strangers in their own homes, ghosts haunting a world that could never truly understand what they had witnessed. The psychological toll was staggering. Shell shock, what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, plagued countless veterans who found themselves trapped between two worlds. They would wake in the dead of night, drenched in sweat, believing they were back in a foxhole under enemy fire. The sound of a car backfiring could send them diving for cover. A crowded room might trigger memories of packed troop transports heading towards certain death. Many struggled with what psychologists now call moral injury, the deep spiritual wound that comes from participating in or witnessing acts that violate one's fundamental beliefs about right and wrong. They had done things in war that haunted them, things that no amount of rationalization about duty and survival could fully justify. They had killed men who were probably no different from themselves, young soldiers fighting for their own countries and families. The guilt was omnipresent and crushing. Why had they survived when so many good men had perished? What cosmic injustice had spared them while claiming their friends? This survivor's guilt ate away at them like acid, making them question their worthiness to enjoy the peace that others had died to secure. Some found it impossible to celebrate or even experience joy, feeling that happiness was a betrayal of their fallen comrades. Relationships became casualties of war as well. Wives and girlfriends who had waited faithfully often found themselves living with men they no longer recognized. The gentle boy who had left for war had returned as a hardened stranger who flinched at unexpected touch and couldn't speak of what he had seen. The easy intimacy they had once shared was replaced by an unbridgeable chasm of experience. Children looked at their fathers with a mixture of awe and fear, sensing something dark and dangerous beneath the surface. These men had learned to compartmentalize emotion, to shut down feeling in order to function in the face of horror. But that same emotional numbness that had been essential for survival made it nearly impossible to reconnect with the tender aspects of human experience. The physical scars were often easier to bear than the psychological ones. A missing limb could be explained, accommodated, even honored as a visible symbol of sacrifice. But the invisible wounds defied understanding or sympathy. Society expected these heroes to simply pick up where they had left off, to be grateful for their survival and get on with their lives. The reality was far more complex and painful. many veterans turned to alcohol as their only means of escape from the constant replay of traumatic memories. They drank to silence the voices of dead friends, to blur the images of carnage that played endlessly in their minds. Some became violent, their carefully controlled aggression spilling over into domestic life. Others retreated into complete isolation, unable to bear the weight of human contact. The nightmares were perhaps the cruelest torment of all. In sleep, they were defenseless against the flood of memories that their conscious minds worked so hard to suppress. They relived the worst moments over and over, trapped in an endless loop of terror and helplessness. Some stopped sleeping altogether, afraid of what awaited them in dreams. For many, the war never truly ended. They remained perpetually vigilant, scanning for threats that no longer existed, ready for battles that would never come. The hypervigilance that had kept them alive in combat became a prison in peacetime, making relaxation impossible and turning every day into an exhausting exercise in survival. The bonds forged in combat often proved to be the only relationships these men could maintain. Only another veteran could truly understand the weight they carried, the nightmares they endured, the guilt that consumed them. Veterans' organizations became lifelines, places where they could speak the unspeakable and find some measure of understanding among those who had walked the same dark path. Some found solace in work, throwing themselves into careers with the same intensity they had once applied to warfare. Others discovered that civilian life felt meaningless after the heightened reality of combat. How could a job in an office or factory compare to the life and death stakes they had grown accustomed to? Many struggled with a profound sense of purposelessness, feeling like actors playing roles in a theatre they no longer believed in. The lucky ones found ways to channel their experiences into something meaningful. They became teachers, counselors, advocates for peace. They used their hard-won wisdom to help others avoid the mistakes that had led to such devastating conflict. But even these men carried scars that would never fully heal, wounds that would ache with every storm, every anniversary, every unexpected reminder of what they had endured. The legacy of their trauma extended beyond their own lives, affecting their children and grandchildren in ways that are only now being understood. The sons and daughters of World War II veterans often reported feelings of inexplicable anxiety, depression, and emotional numbness. The trauma had been passed down, like a genetic inheritance, written into the very DNA of subsequent generations. And yet, for all their suffering, these men had also experienced something profound and transformative. They had seen the absolute worst of humanity and somehow maintained their own humanity. They had faced their own mortality and emerged with a deeper appreciation for life. They had learned that they were capable of extraordinary courage, endurance, and sacrifice. Many developed a fierce appreciation for simple pleasures that others took for granted. A hot meal, a warm bed, the sound of children playing, the absence of gunfire. They understood in their bones what truly mattered and what was merely superficial noise. This hard-won wisdom, though purchased at a terrible price, became their gift to a world that desperately needed to learn the true cost of war. As the years passed and the immediate trauma began to fade, some found ways to integrate their experiences into a fuller understanding of life. They became living bridges between the world of peace and the world of war, helping others understand that freedom is never free and that the price of civilization is eternal vigilance against the forces that would destroy it. Their stories became cautionary tales and inspiration alike, reminding future generations that ordinary people are capable of both extraordinary evil and extraordinary good. They had seen the depths to which humanity could sink and the heights to which it could soar, often within the same day, sometimes within the same person. The brutal life of a World War II soldier did not end when the guns fell silent. It continued in the quiet moments of despair, the sudden flashbacks, the relationships that could never be fully repaired, the trust that could never be completely restored. But it also continued in the wisdom gained, the appreciation for peace, the determination to prevent such horrors from happening again. These men had paid the ultimate price for victory, not just those who died, but those who lived. They had sacrificed not just their youth, but their innocence, not just their bodies, but their souls. The brutal reality of being a soldier in World War II was a nightmare that tested the very limits of human endurance and spirit. These men faced unimaginable horrors on a daily basis, from the deafening artillery barrages that could drive men mad, to watching their closest friends die in their arms on foreign battlefields. They endured months of living in freezing trenches, surviving on meagre rations, and carrying the constant weight of knowing that each day could be their last. The physical and psychological toll was devastating, leaving scars that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Yet through it all, these ordinary men found extraordinary courage, forming bonds of brotherhood that transcended nationality and circumstance, proving that even in humanity's darkest hour, the human spirit refuses to be broken.